So now I want to discuss the four philosophical lenses by which we view prophecy, apocalyptic literature, um, like we find in the book of Revelation and the books of the prophets. The main philosophical lenses through which the book of Revelation is viewed include Historicism, Preterism, Futurism, and Idealism. These lenses offer different interpretations of the symbolic language and prophetic claims within Revelation. Here's a breakdown for each lens. Historicism. This view interprets Revelation's prophecies and other apocalyptic literature as a historical sequence of events, starting with the time of Daniel and continuing through church history, culminating in the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was a popular viewpoint uh, really from the beginning of the Protestant Reformation all the way into really into the 19th century, up until the 19th century. Preterism, this perspective sees the prophecies of Revelation as primarily fulfilled in the events surrounding the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. And there's preterism, but then there's also partial preterism. Futurism, this lens interprets Revelation as primarily describing future events that are yet to unfold, particularly those leading up to the second coming. And I have to say Futurism is the most popular viewpoint of the book of Revelation and apocalyptic literature that is really dominant today. Idealism, this approach understands Revelation's symbolic language as a general portrayal of the eternal struggle between good and evil rather than specific historical events. It focuses on the book's theological messages and themes rather than a literal interpretation. Further breakdown of the four philosophical lenses. Historicism and eschatology is an approach to interpreting biblical prophecies, particularly those found in the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel, by identifying symbolic figures and events with actual historical happenings and societal structures. It views the fulfillment of prophecies as a continuous, sequential progression throughout history rather than a single future event. Key aspects of historicism: historical fulfillment. Historicists believe that the prophecies of the Bible, especially in Revelation and Daniel and the Olivet Discourse and some of the books of the prophets, are not symbolic or metaphorical, but rather literal accounts of actual historical events that will rise and fall in the rise and fall of various empires and powers. Sequential fulfillment. Historicists interpret these prophecies as unfolding sequentially throughout history from the time of the prophets to the end of the world. And identifying symbols. They identify symbolic figures and events in the prophecies with specific historical figures, institutions, and events. For example, the beast of Revelation or the Antichrist may be linked to the Roman Empire or the papacy. Continuous history. Historicists view the fulfillment of prophecy as a continuous process, not a sudden dramatic event at the end of time. Examples of historicist interpretations. The Antichrist. Early Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin often identified the papacy as the Antichrist of biblical prophecy. End of the world predictions. Historicists have sometimes used their interpretations of prophecies to predict the end of the world. This is what we call date setting in the Christian church. Uh, just FYI, date setting is always a bad idea because it almost never comes to pass. And there's a reason why Jesus said, "No man will know the day or the hour." He said the end of the world will come like a thief in the night. That means nobody will know. Now, Christians will know the signs of the times, but they will not know the date so accurately that they're able to predict it, as some historicists have tried to do. Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is known for its historicist approach to biblical prophecy, particularly in its interpretation of the book of Daniel. Jehovah's Witnesses are also big historicists. They take a historicist interpretation of biblical prophecy, particularly as it relates to the timing of God's kingdom. Criticisms of historicism. The subjectivity of historicism is often criticized because it's a very subjective thing. It's open to one's own personal interpretation. Forced interpretation. Some argue that historicism can lead to forced interpretations of biblical texts, pushing them beyond their intended meaning. You know, when you try to read the book of Revelation with a newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other, oftentimes you'll try to um, fit the historical events going on around you, or the ones that have been noticed in the past, try to fit them into specific Bible verses when really the Bible is not talking about those specific dates or events or figures at all. Lack of clarity. Others argue that the sequential fulfillment of prophecies as envisioned by historicists are not always clear or consistent in the text themselves. Now we're going to move from historicism to preterism. This is the second viewpoint that we're talking about. Preterism is an eschatological view that interprets many, if not all, biblical prophecies as having already been fulfilled, primarily in the 1st century AD, 70 AD. This is in contrast to other views like Futurism, which believe these prophecies are not yet to occur. Preterism comes in two main forms, as we mentioned earlier, partial preterism and then full preterism. Partial preterism believes that most of the prophecies in the Bible have already been fulfilled, but not all. Full preterism believes that all the prophecies were fulfilled, including the ones about the second coming of Christ, the judgment, the new heavens and the new earth. And this is why full preterism is, in my opinion, heresy, because it makes the second coming of Christ a past event and that it's already happened. And this is just clear from reading the Bible that Jesus has not returned. This is actually a heresy that was condemned by Paul in the book of Thessalonians. So now the preterism explained. The term preterism comes from the Latin word preter, meaning past. It essentially suggests that the end times events described in the Bible, particularly in the book of Revelation and passages like the Olivet Discourse, have already unfolded in history, mainly around the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Partial versus full preterism. Partial preterism, this view acknowledges that while many prophecies were fulfilled in the 1st century, some, such as the final judgment or the return of Christ, still have a future element or a future fulfillment. Full preterism, this perspective argues that all prophecies, including the resurrection, Christ's second coming, and the final judgment, were fulfilled in the 1st century, with the destruction of Jerusalem serving as a key event. Again, heresy alert. So, key interpretations. The book of Revelation, preterists often interpret Revelation as referring to events that happened in the Roman Empire, particularly the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and the persecution of Christians under Emperor Nero. The Olivet Discourse found in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, where Jesus speaks about the destruction of the temple in the end times, is also interpreted by preterists as having been fulfilled in the 1st century. The second coming, full preterists often interpret the second coming of Christ as having already occurred in the destruction of Jerusalem rather than a future bodily event. Now, the third viewpoint is Futurism. And again, just to remind you, these are the four viewpoints that are, or you could say philosophical lenses by which we interpret prophecy, interpret the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic prophetic literature. And so when you read the book of Revelation, you're going to be reading, whether you know this or not, you're going to be reading those prophecies in the book of Revelation through some lens. And it's going to either be a preteristic, futuristic, historic, or idealist interpretation. And you may view the book of Revelation through all four of these lenses at some point, which is typically what I do, because I believe the book of Revelation and apocalyptic literature has a past, present, and future fulfillment. So, Futurism, in the context of Christian eschatology, is a view that interprets prophecies, particularly in the book of Revelation, as referring to future events immediately prior to the second coming of Christ. It contrasts with other interpretations like Preterism and Historicism, which view the prophecies as already fulfilled or unfolding throughout history. Futurism is often linked to pre-tribulation or premillennialism of today, which is, again, is the most widely held popular viewpoint of Christians today. With amillennialism declining, but was the most popular, or has been the most popular in Christian history from somewhere around 400 AD all the way up until really the 1800s. Key aspects of Futurism and eschatology. It focuses on future events. Futurism emphasizes that many prophecies, especially those in the book of Revelation, describe events that have not yet occurred, including the rapture, the tribulation, and the millennial kingdom. Hence the name Futurism. Everything that's in the book of Revelation pretty much is a future event that has not been fulfilled. The literal interpretation. Futurists often favor a literal interpretation of biblical texts. Not that the other viewpoints don't take a literal interpretation, just a less than hard wooden literal interpretation, as the futurists often do. Its connection to dispensationalism, as we discussed earlier, the pre-tribulational, premillennial understanding of the book of Revelation or the millennium is often dispensational. Dispensational is one of the forms of premillennialism, founded by John Nelson Darby. Futurism is frequently associated with dispensationalism, a theological system that divides history into distinct dispensations or periods, and also makes a sharp distinction between Israel and the church. Influenced John Nelson Darby and the Scofield Reference Bible were key figures in popularizing futurism. Idealism. Here's the fourth and final viewpoint, or philosophical lens, by which to view prophecy. Idealism in Christian eschatology. Idealist interpretations of Revelation see its symbolic imagery as representing universal truths and spiritual struggles rather than specific historical events. This approach emphasizes the book's moral and spiritual relevance for believers' lives in the present rather than focusing on future prophecies. Idealism is often associated with amillennialism and is found in various forms, from radical interpretations that see the book as purely symbolic to more moderate views that allow for some historical fulfillment. A man by the name of G.K. Bill has a commentary on the book of Revelation. He takes I believe it's called a redemptive historical idealist view, which sort of takes all of these viewpoints into consideration when interpreting the book of Revelation. And I find that to be the most helpful and proper way to view the book of Revelation and prophecy in the Bible in general. Because, again, it has a past, present, and future fulfillment. All of the prophecy in the Bible does it. Some of it's already been fulfilled, some of it is being fulfilled, and some of it will be, or still yet has to be fulfilled. Key aspects of the idealist approach to Revelation. Symbolic interpretation. Idealists generally interpret the visions and symbols in Revelation as symbolic representations of spiritual realities and struggles, not as literal historical events. They emphasize the book's relevance for ongoing life of the church and its spiritual warfare against evil in the present rather than its predictions about future events, meaning the book of Revelation is a book of it's like the epistles of the New Testament. It's for every church age. It's for every Christian in every church age throughout history. And I believe that. Again, that's why I believe there are some reasons and there are some there's proper times to see the book of Revelation through a idealist view, idealist lens. Idealists often see Revelation as offering profound spiritual truths about the nature of the conflict between good and evil, the ultimate victory of Christ, and the importance of perseverance and faith. Amillennialism. Many idealists associate this interpretation with amillennialism, which denies a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, hence the symbolic nature of idealism. Variations within idealism. There are variations within the idealist approach. Some radical interpretations see the book as entirely symbolic, while others allow for some historical fulfillment of events such as the first and second coming of Christ. And if you've noticed, some of this information I'm reading and mentioning here has been repeated. Yes, repetition is the mother of all learning, so it's good to hear these things over and over. There are some more recent philosophical lenses, such as a redemptive historical modified idealist. That's what G.K. Bill holds. A redemptive historical modified idealist approach. This is the fifth. Now I'm not gonna. I labeled this video as the four philosophical lenses because this fifth one here is so new and not so widely held that I feel like it's probably not the best to discuss in great detail, especially considering that I really don't understand it myself, even though I kind of hold to it. Um, I believe that the redemptive historical modified idealist, which really just takes all four of these lenses into consideration when studying the prophecy of the Bible. That's pretty much what it is. But to discuss it in the length that I've discussed these other ones, I can't because I don't really know that much about it, except for the fact that it takes all four of these philosophical viewpoints, the idealist, the historicist, the futurist, and the preterist viewpoint into consideration when studying the prophecy of the Bible. But if I had to guess and describe this viewpoint as something like a more moderate approach to the idealist understanding of the book of Revelation, not so much preterist, not so much futurist, but more of a modified, as the name suggests, modified idealist understanding of the book of Revelation and prophecy in general, while also taking into account the historical and literal reality of the book of Revelation and its prophetic nature to literally predict certain historical events that have and are and will eventually take place. So there you have it. I know that is a lot of information, and it is a brief discussion and a brief, really just a general description of these four philosophical lenses. But this is interesting stuff, and it really does help you interpret the prophecy of the Bible when you know these things. So